Thanks, Pablo, for that warm welcome. And thanks everybody else for being here today, for taking the time to do something uh, that involves connecting with others, learning other people's stories. And sometimes we just can't fit another meeting in, but you made it here. And everybody who had registration challenges or sign in challenges, thanks for having the resilience to try again. I am really grateful for UUSJ for pulling this together, for having the wisdom to bring in people like Reverend Ranwa Hamami, who can open up the space and pivot to do something so deep and meaningful. I'm really grateful to the board and leadership of UUSJ for their deep work and transformation to build accountable relationships into the ways that they're doing things. We've also got to give a shout out to the people running things in the background. I believe Paulette Lickman Panzer is out there in the Zoom space helping run the show. And I know that we've got many other volunteers involved in this. So thank you everyone for taking the care to put this together. I'm so glad to get to share something that I think is really important and rewarding in what otherwise can feel like a struggle for justice. I titled my talk, I Can't Be the Change on My Own. And that idea comes out of a moment of dismay and epiphany in my life. It was a couple of decades ago, and I was starting my master's in social work. I was standing in the hallway outside my professor's door, and I read this quote, "Be the change you want to see in the world." How cool, I thought. This person has read the works of Mahatma Gandhi, and this quote is so wise. It's a good reminder. If I want justice, equity, if I want society to empower the oppressed, I need to be who I want others to be. I need to live by example. Okay. But what would that look like for me? Should I share my home with houseless folks? Should I redistribute my meager graduate assistantship stipend with hungry families? How about I forgo this costly degree and join an alternative activist organization? Maybe those would have been powerful things to do, each of them. And I did none of them. I immediately felt inadequate and inauthentic. Have you ever felt inadequate in your justice work? Perhaps you have to select only a handful of issues because you don't have the time or energy or volunteers to sustain more effort than you're already doing. If we were superheroes, we could change our ways and make everyone follow. We could get enough volunteers to respond to all the crises in our world. We could persuade the policymakers with that perfect argument, get the power brokers to change. But we aren't superheroes, and, well, we shouldn't be. One problem with our favorite stories and even our favorite stories and heroes from history is that they appear as singular heroes that save the day acting alone. That is a dangerous myth. To create the justice-filled world, the one that affirms the inherent worth and dignity of all and upholds equity and justice, where power lives in interdependence, in such a justice-filled, beloved community, no one can be the superhero. No group can be the saviors. Any arbitrary accumulation of power into one individual or group is opposed to the ideals of beloved community. Eventually, I learned that Gandhi never really even said, "Be the change," in that simplistic manner. He was only partially summarized in that famous misquote. Gandhi's message was more nuanced. And that misquote we are so familiar with was taken from a speech where he said something much more important. I'm going to share my screen briefly so you can reflect on this on screen. Gandhi said, "We but mirror the world. All the tendencies present in the outer world are to be found in the world of our body. If we could change ourselves, the tendencies in the world would also change. As a man changes his own nature, so does the attitude of the world change towards him. This is the divine mystery supreme. A wonderful thing it is and the source of our happiness. We need not wait to see what others do. That's what Mahatma Gandhi said. He also used the conventional gender-centric, male-centric language of the time. Gandhi was talking about how we each internalize the tendencies in our wider societies. He was admonishing people to try to change their inner self as a source of joy. He says happiness, a source of inner transformation. Not because that solves the world's problems, but because it resolves our inner torment, reconciling our longing with our being. Taken out of his cultural context, the misquote is sadly individualistic. From Gandhi's Hindu roots, his work on the self was a deep spiritual quest founded in millennia of practices. It had a deeper meaning, not a diluted individualistic answer to social problems. Let us not forget, Gandhi knew all too well the vital power of collective action. Just take in this image where he is leading the fellow marchers during the march against the British salt laws. Gandhi knew change did not come with individual action. The misquote encourages people to think that inner perfection is a solution to social problems. And inevitably falling short of that, we internalize failure. When we can't be the change or make the change, we failed in advance. We feel bad, inadequate. We become spiritually exhausted. And I bet some of us here can relate to the experience of exhaustion lately. Congregations today are faced with a triple whammy of spiritual exhaustion around social justice work. The pressures are mounting in terms of economic and environmental crises. National and global politics seem to be backsliding into division, nationalism, and fundamentalism. And we are worn down by a global pandemic. Worn down physically, emotionally, and spiritually. If your congregation or group's justice work has fizzled recently, you are not alone. If you are going strong and aren't sure how to sustain, good for you, and you're not alone. If your head is spinning just trying to keep track of the most pressing crises in your local area, you're not alone. And this brings us to an idea I really want to sit with you today. I can't be the change on my own. You can't, and none of us should. We are not suffering alone, and we must not try to imagine success on our own. Existing alone as individuals or even social justice groups, we are easily overcome by the mountain of challenges. I want to invite you to take a moment and think about the challenges, the obstacles in our way. I'm going to invite you to put them in the chat. I had a Mentimeter planned, but I think we've had enough experiments and trials with technology. We'll just stay on Zoom. So in the chat, I want to invite you to put 3 words, no sentences, just 3 words that describe, and they can be for different challenges, the pebbles, the challenges in your way of social justice work. What are the top 3 challenges? I'm going to put mine in the chat too. I'm taking these in, and I see some challenges in common. There's definitely some things that overlap, a lot of things that overlap. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Nobody trips over mountains. It's the small pebble that causes you to stumble. Pass all the pebbles in your path and you will find you have crossed the mountain." I think looking at all these challenges, it can feel like the pebbles in our way are a mountain. It can feel overwhelming. To face the mountain, Emerson is suggesting we face and overcome each little pebble on our way. We pass the pebbles. But I think we have to do more than just pass them. We need to learn through them, learn from the path. I want to invite you to take a little imaginative walk or journey with me into systems theory. I said theory, so you're expecting a lecture. But let's just have a little imagination, and we're going to come back to the challenges that you've all shared in the chat later. We're going to exercise our imaginations here because there's something that we vitally need in order to move past these mounting challenges in our way. A bold imagination. And we need to practice imagining together. Imagine that you are traveling along a mountain path. You are an example of a system. And imagine you're moving along a somewhat smoother path than I just showed on screen. You're moving along a curving mountain path in a wheelchair, a common way of moving that many of us use and or will use at some point in our lives. A core tenet of systems theory says that a system wants to maintain itself. It takes in information from the outside environment and inner environment to be able to adapt and rebalance. But if a system stops learning and adapting when things are out of balance, it becomes brittle. A brittle system only has one way of being, one thing it does, and it doesn't like to adapt well to feedback. That's not a good idea on a mountain slope, is it? Imagine you're rolling along a mountain slope and you get brittle. You decide to ignore feedback from your gut or from your inner ear that tells you, hey, you're rolling too fast. You're curving too hard. You want to be tough. And what if also you've been so tough you ignore squeaky brakes from your chair all last week? Now you are sloping down with a large stone in the path and no room for swerving around it. Welcome to your non-responsive brittle system that's precipitously out of balance. What could happen? I like happy endings, and I know you have enough stress in your lives. So let's imagine that just before it's too late, you tune into your gut and your inner ear. You apply the brakes that miraculously still work, and you slow down. And you safely navigate around the stone. Then you pledge to take better care of the chair from here on out and to pay attention to your body. Lesson learned. In our justice work, we need to be able to learn like this too. We need to be able to notice when we're swerving off course, and we need to be able to navigate our obstacles. But often in our justice work, especially if any of us are experiencing privilege, we don't get reliable information from our gut. We don't. Losing privilege can feel vulnerable, scary, bad, because we feel faster than we think rationally. It's easy to get bad information and veer off course. We have to have multiple trust-filled relationships that affirm the authority and power of diverse folks most impacted by injustice. Even when we occupy marginalized identities, we still lack insight into the experiences of people with different marginalized identities. We need relationships to give us the information about staying on course, about when things aren't working, about when we need to imagine more boldly. Relationships where folks facing injustice communicate openly and where everyone can learn and grow. In Gandhi's actual quote, he said, "We mirror the world. We but mirror the world." Too often, our ways of doing justice work are just as brittle as our wider society. Too often, our dominant society does not like to pay attention to the people who are suffering. Our dominant society does not like to rebalance and seek equity. But you and I, as UUs, we want equity. We want justice. We want to affirm inherent dignity, power, and interdependence. Let us heed the wisdom of our great teachers then, that even though we dream of justice and equity, if we are not careful and intentional, if we do not receive help and information from our neighbors, we will tend to recreate the brittle and imbalanced patterns of the larger society. This internal struggle is one of the pebbles in our path. It's a boulder, actually, but it's one we can navigate. We must make the obstacles the focus of our path. Recall all those barriers, those pebbles in the way. There were a lot in common. In my quick skim, you shared barriers, and I see similarities. Struggles to find financial sustainability, volunteer sustainability, intractable politicians, partnerships that are fraught, perhaps with competing interests or competing demands on time, or just challenging cultural divides. These are problems that mirror society. They are clues to systemic vulnerabilities. Our dominant sociocultural system disincentivizes feedback and growth. Our society is by nature a system doomed to become more and more brittle. The system also teaches us not to push too hard. It incentivizes us to think small. And that is why it is so important to imagine boldly and playfully. As someone who has been a program evaluation consultant for many years, I know what I'm about to say is somewhat heretical, but sometimes goals are the problem. Goals are often misleading or misled. The goals we select can too often be overly pragmatic. In our brittle society, there are many mechanisms that maintain the status quo, and expecting instant gratification is one of them. Social change or systemic change takes time and involves disruption and discomfort. But if everyone with an ounce of privilege expects instant gratification, we have a feedback problem. If we select a worthy change goal, we will soon receive feedback that nothing has changed yet. There is resistance. We are not having an impact. Being accustomed to gratification, the gratification of success, a privileged person might take that as a sign of failure, a sign they should quit, a sign they should set a smaller goal. Indeed, in some schools of evaluation, you would have been taught to quit a lofty goal, recalibrate, and select something achievable, smaller, easier. It'll give you an indication of your success and your power. Without apparent success, we're taught, we're just wasting our time. And we should make more realistic goals. Think realistically. Think smaller. So then with your small goal in hand that does not challenge the system or only minimally touches it, you will get a nice feeling of success. You will get kudos from people in power, including your donors. Think smaller. That means that the people who are the keepers of power, all those thriving in their landscape of privilege, the change you make is not going to bother them. We work hard then at maintaining the status quo when we think small. We but mirror the world, said Gandhi. The tendencies of society play out in our social justice bodies too, our committees and groups. The tendencies of society will show up in the way we plan, the way we set goals, and the way we judge ourselves. They will show up in the way we imagine our work, who we are in relationship with, who we invite into our imagining, and the tendencies of society will shape whether or how much joy we find in our work. Are we dependent on success, or do we have other sources of joy? To climb the mountain of injustice, we need to deal with the pebbles in our way, but we need to do more than just overcome small goals. We need to learn from the pebbles and boulders, especially our relationship boulders. So let's come down from the mountain and into the world of concrete. We will shift from our creative imagination to our practical imagination, from systems theory to social movements theory. And in this shift, I will back up a little and take the space to reintroduce myself. In my eagerness to share gratitude, I forgot to share my location. So here I am, Reverend Pippin Whitaker. I'm the affiliated community minister in Columbia, South Carolina, and I'm also the executive director of the brand new South Carolina UU Justice Alliance. That is bringing social justice leaders and social justice work across the state together for collective action and to support one another. My pronouns are she and her. I live in Salaguetti, which is the old Cherokee place, also called Columbia, South Carolina. It is important for you to know who I am and where I am as we come down from this mountain of ideas into some practical realities, because there are stories here that I have learned in this last year in South Carolina, learning from the organizing that is going on here. And I can't wait to share with you a story of hope. And I know you have stories too. So I want you to think about what stories you're going to share today. So let's think about social movements, the science of social movements. The model that you're looking at is from Dr. Paul Almeida. He is a well-known social movements theory sociologist. And so this is a culmination of a lot of different theories. The idea is we want sustained social justice work. And what this model does is pull together what appear to be the core elements for getting social justice action to sustain itself. We need opportunities. We need a resource infrastructure. We need the resources to make things happen. And a lot of that is networking and organizing. And we need framing. And that leads to a sustained movement. I want to tell you a little about framing, because as we think about building relationships, we need to think about how we operate in frames. Frames shape our cognition. They shape what our imagination can bring into being. They are systematic ways of organizing and viewing the world that structure everything we can think about. And they rationalize events. And our frames can reproduce social structure. You might think of frames like bias, but actually frames are bigger and deeper than bias in your mind. If you think of a building, bias would be the fact that you like a certain color brick or a certain type of brick. But the frame would be the frame of the building that tells you where you can put bricks at all. Frames summon bias too. Let's say you're organizing a social justice event and you are talking about multicultural growth. This will trigger in everybody who comes a frame of appreciating diversity. But if you call it addressing the problem of undocumented immigrants, you might unwittingly be triggering a frame about nativism. People's minds might go to the idea of thinking about whether someone is worthy, whether they were born in this or not. In that kind of a meeting, people's brains might be on the lookout for anyone who seems to be a member of an outgroup. Sociologists have documented how the white racial frame operates underneath so much of our society. You could take a look at this book if you really want to go deep, but let's just take a moment to bring the frame lightly into view. The white racial frame says that white people are saviors. They are good people, keepers of reason, and generally stronger and more capable. That frame rationalizes for many people why white people have disproportionate power and privilege. And it is internalized as the idea of, I'm good, I must know best if I'm white. And if I'm non-white, it can be internalized as the opposite. Everyone has to wrestle with the dominant racial frame. But there are alternatives out there. And when you're organizing an event, you can draw on an alternative frame. Some frames are called the home culture frames. And these frames really counteract the negative impact of a white racial frame. An example is the home cultural frame of Black is beautiful, or my family is valuable. Then there's also the liberty and justice counterframe, which I think is especially powerful for UUs. Liberty and justice is inscribed in our country and our core documents, and it should include everyone. Drawing on this frame is helpful to describe hypocrisy and point out opportunities to resolve it. The one thing missing from this whole scheme, though, is something that is assumed. And that is missing in the fabric. It's the piece that makes it all possible and that makes the goal meaningful. The driving force that makes all of this movement, this model of social movements possible. The path, the goal, and the joy. That is mutual liberatory relationships. It is through relationships that seek not only mutual benefit, but mutual liberation, to give one another more creative power. Those relationships are what build infrastructure, allow us to seize opportunities, allow us to frame a story and vision together, and sustain ourselves in perpetual motion towards beloved community. Remember the common pebbles? A common pebble is a sense of being alone, not having enough volunteers, not enough partners, not enough donors. And that is a product of a society that has strategically failed to teach us how to value and build relationships, how to craft something that is mutually liberating, and how to allow ourselves to be transformed by those relationships. What we need instead is to understand that the how of getting people mobilized is not the means to some glorious end. Our goal is not to push some policy to have a victory. Our goal needs to be the path, and it needs to be a joyful path. Our goal should be relationships that liberate one another. Not, and I hope this gives you a sense of relief, your goal is not to sell your program, to get people on board, but to reconcile yourselves with your neighbors and reframe the problem together. Craft a story and a future together. The kind of relationship I want to invite you to imagine in all the settings of your life is not about checking a box to say you benefited and the other person benefited. That's transaction. Transactional society, that's what we have. We either have rampant models of transaction or extraction. In a transaction, you pay the store for a thing, they pay the clerk, and the clerk gives you a thing, and no one and no thing is transformed. Unless you bought a snack, in which case I guess you could say the snack will soon be transformed into energy, but that's getting into the weeds. In a relationship of mutual liberation, we do not collapse into transaction. Instead, we sustain a bond and hold a commitment to nurture a relationship, to nurture relationships that create the potential for all parties to grow in creative action. A church that feeds the hungry meets a vital human need, and it needs to keep meeting that need. But a mutually creative relationship emerges when they build a relationship that allows them to deeply understand one another, the people who have the food and the people who have the hunger, and to frame a creative story. People who are hungry, what is their vision? What is their power? What is their authority? Where are they on their journey to justice? I share a story from South Carolina that I hope illuminates this process. And I gotta say, the experience can sound messy and like you're going nowhere at the first. A few years ago, the UU Church of Spartanburg began to imagine different ways of thinking about social justice. Spartanburg is in what we call the upstate of South Carolina. It's the northern part. We call it upstate. They decided to try to get to know their neighbors better, just to be in closer relationships. They didn't have a specific goal. They had started to try to get to know a Hispanic organization now called Alianza Spartanburg, and several UU church members went to their events, and a couple of them met regularly. Then when the pandemic hit, they started to meet and talk about what is happening. Because of their relationship, the organization Alianza felt like it would be worth the time to meet with the church and tell them just how bad things are. They shared how hard hit Latinx families were, with 3 times the COVID rate in the northern region, upstate of South Carolina, but how so many were not eligible for relief from the CARES Act. People who would have to risk getting sick or spreading the virus in order to feed their families, because there was no relief available. Now, Alianza trusted the church, and at the end of March, in a message dated March 28, 2020, they asked for help. Within days, the church had shifted their share the plate for April and had a whole plan to raise funds to support immigrants. This church typically takes in $1,000 in their offering plate each month. Incredibly, in 2 months of collections, because they extended the collections for another month, and asking the congregation for help, they raised over $20,000. How was the church able to respond so quickly? The social justice leaders were in a relationship that built trust. They were open to feedback. They were open to responding to whatever need emerged. And they were communicating all along the way with the wider congregation so that the whole congregation was in that relationship. Now, I imagine that the UU Church of Spartanburg may have encountered a few pebbles on the way, unless they're superhumans. But assuming they're not superhumans, perhaps they had to overcome some societal conditioning. Perhaps some people in the church who were white, who were meeting with Alianza, perhaps they had to wrestle with the dominant social frame's notion that white people need to come in knowing best and having a plan and acting as saviors. Perhaps they had to push back on nativist frames that people born here would know best or be entitled to resources. I don't know, but I do know that they actively and wisely used framing. They used framing in interviews and in conversations with the congregation. In an interview between the church's minister, Reverend Scott Neely, and Natalia Valenzuela Swanson, a steering committee member of the organization Alianza, Natalia was careful to point out how the undocumented immigrants left out of the CARES Act had contributed over $160 million in taxes to the state of South Carolina. She was directly countering the nativist frame and showing its hypocrisy. By being in conversation, the church could use that frame too. This story shows the importance of wrestling with our internal framing and of continually framing and reframing together so that communication unveils hypocrisy and invites people into the frame of justice. This is key. Shift frames. Invite people into the frame of justice. The collaboration between the UU Church and Alianza has grown. Last year, their collaboration led them to create a foundation to support undocumented immigrants that raised almost $100,000 in grants in 2020. And to date, they've raised over $300,000. Imagine all the families whose lives have been transformed. Imagine what else is possible now from this relationship. All possible because the good folks at Spartanburg got curious about connecting with their neighbors, building trust, and staying open to responding as they were asked when a need emerged. Back when the pandemic started, if Spartanburg UU social justice folks had gathered in a room to set a bold goal to help the Latinx community in a small church that collects around $1,000 in monthly collections, do you think they could, in their wildest imaginations, have dreamed of coming up with a goal of raising $300,000 in a matter of months in the middle of a pandemic? That would go directly to immigrant families most in need on an ongoing basis? That they would establish a fund to continue this work into the future? I know they would have come up with something good. But there's no way they could have imagined this, let alone being able to create and carry it out. Not on their own. I know you've got stories too. And as I said, I can't wait to hear them. And I know some of you, I see you in the gallery. I know you have these amazing stories, and I want you to share them. A part of all this that makes my heart light, in addition to all the lives changed, it's all the new possibilities that are born and how enjoyable this work can be. Notice that the work of relationship building is not a burden. And if we aren't overly fixated on getting some outcome done, we can enjoy the time spent with relationships. The Spartanburg church folks joined the Latinx community events and got to know their neighbors. They talked and learned more about one another's lives. By responding to a need, they had the joy of celebrating their relationship. And I believe this would have been a joy no matter how much they raised. Here is a truth that the system of hegemonic power does not want you to know. The ego boost of achieving a traditional SMART goal or outcome cannot begin to touch the joy of showing up for your neighbor when they ask you for company on a hard journey. The seemingly small thing, the gift of a committed, accountable, mutually creative relationship, it's available to us all. And it is what we need to make social movements happen and sustain themselves. It is what we need to find joy and laughter in this work. And it is what we need to unravel the system of oppression. That is why there is so much effort spent distracting us from that. There are many ways into these relationships, many paths. Because our society has such heavy emphasis on transactional and extractive relationships, we need to spend time thinking about mutuality. In a mutually creative relationship, all parties are getting out of the relationship something they equally value. And there is a commitment to the balance of mutual benefit in that relationship and a balance of mutual power. And also to being changed by one another, to being changed and transformed by that relationship. I wonder where you are finding that kind of mutuality in your social justice work. Where are you finding it? I want to invite you to pull up that chat again and just write, where are you finding mutuality? Maybe it's among social justice leaders. Maybe it's in your wider community, in your congregation, if you're acting in a church. Maybe it's with one of your partners, a partner organization or a group you've been working with. Where are you finding mutuality? Not transaction, and certainly not extraction. Someone's put in there the team engaging with the eighth principle. I think that's a great example. Online communities. I'm finding mutuality in my work in the State Action Network and in the Commission on Social Witness. The ICPP partners, I know they're doing awesome work. Where are we finding mutuality? I want you to keep typing in. Sometimes it takes a while to pull up that chat. And I want you to think about, in those places where you're finding mutuality, what makes mutuality possible in those relationships? Do you find a common frame, a way of looking at the world? Do you share a story or a common cultural background? What you find in common can be built in common. So I invite you to think about how you can build relationships across those boundaries so that you find more mutuality. We need many diverse, widespread relationships of mutual creativity to create social change. That's what we need. And there are many tools out there. I could share some ideas if you want later on today, like eco maps and tips for multicultural relationship building. You can look at TED Talks and YouTube videos on that too. But all these tools are here to encourage you. There is no one way to build mutually liberating relationships, and you'll probably say something awkward at some point. Almost any strategy is better than not trying at all. Reach out and try. Show up for your neighbors. Be patient and don't judge yourself for not knowing everything, for not having a plan, for not being able to do anything, for not being able to show outcomes. You need many varied, trusting relationships to create social change, not outcomes. Together, we imagine more than is possible alone. When we remain alone, we may be tempted to imagine small, attainable visions, practical goals, and to receive the false gratification that comes when we only pretend to nudge the status quo. Or if we remain alone, we could be daunted by the unflinching powers that be because they are unflinching and sink into exhausted despair. Alone, we berate ourselves for our failure to redistribute our personal power in every way, our failure to radically reduce our consumption or even to reliably recycle, our failure to write the compelling argument with the right words that swayed the stubborn senator. We simply cannot be the change on our own. And thank God for that. What new tyrants we would be if we could. The key is in a turn away from getting what we think we want, toward accountability, toward mutually life-giving creative relationships. Relationships that allow us to imagine things like the fund to support Latinx immigrants that could not have been imagined by any group alone. Relationships that teach us we don't need to be part of the dominant frames to tell us who is right and who is deserving. Relationships that show us how to slow down, how to show up, and how to enjoy the path that we are on. And so I thank you, USJ, for your vision today, for investing in these relationships, for remembering that we find joy on a long, hard journey through the art of not being alone through the art of mutually liberating relationships. Thank you all, and I cannot wait to learn more from you. What are your hopes? What are the pebbles in your way? And what are the new ways you are learning to imagine boldly? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Pippin Whitaker. Once again, you've brought your brilliance to the table for the folks, and we deeply appreciate that. Your comments have keyed my memory of early on in my career. I worked with a governor, and he said to me, you know, the most important thing we bring to the table is our presence. We've got to be in the community. He actually used the word barrio in order to hear what our constituents want and need. And then we start from there. But it starts with trust, and it starts with being present. And one of the things I heard in your lovely comments are that we have to be brave enough to be present and begin to explore those accountable relationships. So thank you. I did want to give, you know, if you have a burning question, Reverend Pippin said that she would field a couple of questions after her talk. So I want to take her up on that, but I also want to move us along. So if you have a burning question, please raise your hand, use the electronic device. It's usually in your dialogue box. You know, you do your reactions, you raise your hand, and we will field that, and then we will move along. So does anyone have something on their heart or on their mind that they really want to ask Reverend Pippin? It's okay to say no if we don't have a question. I'll just give it a moment.
I think somebody has their hand up.
Okay. Madge Brick and Jim Eagle, I think I see you raising your hand.
Thank you, my Britt. I'm a little worried about our meeting this morning. I'm worried about the word social justice, and I'm wondering whether the human environment is really secondary to the health of the ecosystems, that we all are subsumed under an earth that is the priority of our focus, and all living systems within that earth and our relationship to the more than human as well as each other.
Yeah, well, I think what is important here is intersectionality, and to understand that everyone has a different focus in their heart and a different issue that is most central. And so as we talk about social justice, we can also talk in the same space, in the same conversation, when we are talking about environmental justice, when we are talking about racial justice, when we are talking about justice for all beings. There is overlap. And there are different languages and there are different words, but is there space? Can we find space in our hearts to sit with people who have a different thing that is tugging most closely? So here we're talking with the UUs for social justice, and I know that there are many people, and the social justice umbrella includes environmental justice too. And I know there's lots of people that are concerned about the overall ecology. Pablo can speak to that better than I can. But I think we have to find ways to come together, even though we might have a different focus in our heart.
Thank you for that question and that answer. Anyone else? Well, then I'll just simply, I'll just simply add to the answer and say, I personally certainly think that the environmental and climate justice and climate change challenges are the existential challenge of our generation, but it's also among the most complex things that we as human beings have to enter into collectively. And we can't really enter into those solution generating behaviors if we don't understand the importance of collective liberation and collective action and a mutual, almost communitarian approach to problem solving. So I would look at those intersectionalities and take seriously the notion that we should each follow our passions, but we have to understand that the complex problems of our global society require equally complex coalitions to dismantle those systems of injustice if we want to make long-term sustainable progress. At least that's what I heard when I was working with the people on the island of Vieques, part of the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And we would talk at great length about what were the environmental justice solutions to their suffered harm. Okay, I don't see anyone else asking a question. So I'm gonna continue in my role as MC. I'm gonna thank Reverend Pippen